let's talk about draft betting, and mainly I actually sent you a text at some point over the course of the week as well, because I was getting questions as to, hey man, I'm in XYZ, why can't I bet on the draft? And I'm in this place, whatever, yada yada yada. So why don't we clear some of that up? Why were some people able to bet on the NFL draft and other people not able to bet on the NFL draft?
So the surface level answer, Matt, is that this is about rules and regulations put in place at the state level. It's important to understand that each state sets its own rules. There is no federal rule or national rule about what's allowed and what's not. Each state can choose to allow anything that it wants to allow in terms of permitted events. We can look at a state like Pennsylvania, for example, that started its legal sports betting market with no betting on the draft and has been consistent throughout with that. You can look at a place like where we live in Nevada, where they have weird rules about pulling the draft bets down 24 hours before the event starts. These are all set individually by the regulators in that state. Now, if we get down to the slightly deeper level on this, Matt, and I know you have opinions on this as well, this is an old school versus new school bookmaking question. The old school bookmakers very simply do not like putting up draft bets. They believe that the market is largely a sharp market, that it's not a very public market, that they end up losing money consistently on it. And so in a state like Nevada, you're not going to have pressure from the bookmakers to change these rules. They're going to be very happy keeping them just as they are. So reporting from ESPN, talked to the Nevada Gaming Control Board. The spokesperson said, the rules and regulations are in place because the draft is not based on actual events on the field. It is an event based on selections being made with a lot of insider information flowing around. That kind of gets to the point where I start to have some issues with the way that we regulate this, because there are ways for bookmakers to control markets that have to do with inside information without there being regulations that either prevent it entirely or that pull it down. That's what limits are for. That's what select markets are for. That's what being able to pull individual markets down is for, if you think that those are particularly exposed inside information. And there was one in particular this year with one particular draft prospect's position that I know that there was a lot of concern about insider information. So I think this is a real old school, new school thing. The new school being, you need to be able to differentiate your product. And draft betting is one of those things that across the country can differentiate your product. So I'll turn the floor back after this. Think about the fact that the NFL draft was held in Las Vegas at a time when fans from across the country, 100,000, according to the NFL, 99% of them wearing some sort of team-affiliated gear, are showing up in town wanting to bet on the draft, and they are not able to. And you're having to explain to them from Wednesday at 5 p.m. through the entirety of the draft why there's no draft betting available in Nevada. And it essentially comes down to crankiness and old-school mentality.
Adam, your friend and mine, Dave Farah, hosted about 4 different events down there on the strip for over the course of the last couple of days, and he said, I'm not exaggerating, more than 6 times I got asked by people why I cannot go place a bet on the draft, and he's like, Dave's not really into the rules of everything, so he's like, I don't really know. All I know is that it's been this way ever since I've lived here. And it's kind of like you said, Adam, there's no groundswell from the books themselves to get it changed, because they're more than happy to pull them 24 hours before the actual draft. And so you're definitely right. There were a lot of people who flew into town, got here, had no idea whatsoever, probably came from a state in which they would have been able to live trade the draft, I might add, because there were live betting opportunities during the draft. And Dustin, instead, they get here, get on the ground, and New York was not able to bet the draft. And then I talked to Johnny Avello from DraftKings, and the weird thing just about, Adam, you're talking about how just different states wrote in different things into laws, and some things may or may not be legal, so they just chose not to do certain things, whatever. So there were states where you could bet on the draft before the draft started, but they were not sure whether you could actually live bet the draft, and so you couldn't live bet the draft in certain states. So it was like you could bet it before it happened, but live betting the draft, they were like, yeah, we couldn't really tell whether they were okay with it or not, so we just didn't do it. So there was all kinds of murkiness with all this.
Yeah, I mean, other funny part is, like, is any book really going to lose its shirt on draft betting? Like, they have limits on these things. They're not taking six-figure bets on largely on draft positions and things like that. So this is like, sportsbooks like to complain about things. They're not losing their tons of money on this. This is why it's really more, I think, in the new states, outside of Nevada, it's a customer acquisition retention tool. It's like something else to do while you're watching the draft. People are going to watch the draft anyway. Oh, well, maybe I'll have some money on the draft. It's just something else to engage with. It's a second screen experience while you're watching the draft, which is fun. It's fun to watch a draft, but yeah, let's all say it's certainly more fun to have a little bit of sweat on what's going on when all this stuff is getting announced. So yeah, the funny part to me is like, yeah, yes, there's inside information probably going around. That it'll be reflected in the market. Nobody's taking enough money on this for it to really matter on the grand scheme of things. So I'd rather just see a little bit more open market everywhere. People aren't going to go back into laws and change them. You're right about Nevada. I'm sure, Adam, that there's zero pressure to change this. So it is what it is at this point. But there's confusion around draft betting pretty much everywhere right now.
And Adam, I can only assume, and I'm just completely speaking without any inside knowledge here, whatever. I can only assume by this time next year, we'll at least have clarification in New York one way or the other, like whether they're going to be able to take draft betting or not. I mean, the answer very well might be no, I guess, but like at least we'll have some clarification one way or another, I would assume.
Yeah, and for the latest on this, I would suggest following one of our good friends over at Play New York. Mike Mazzio does a great job of covering the New York sports betting market. You can find him on Twitter, and he talked to Senator Joe Adaba, who's been at the heart of all this. And what we found out before the draft was essentially like, imagine a room full of lawyers all the way up to draft day trying to parse through the law and the rules to figure out whether or not this was something they could do. That was the scene in New York as we tried to straighten out what was going on with the draft. And keep in mind that how many years in a row was the NFL draft held in New York? Now, we're going to another legal sports betting state next year, right? Or 2 years. We're going to Michigan, right? We're going to have a draft in Michigan. So if we have a draft in Michigan, we're going to be doing this again when it comes to making sure that we can offer draft betting markets. And, Matt, you know this as well as I do. There was one book in town in particular that did not put up its draft betting markets until 4 days before the draft, when I've been betting at certain books in town since February. They didn't put up the markets till 4 days before and then put them up with $1,000 limits. And I saw professional bettors saying, hey, all right, $1,000 limits. Finally, I can get some action down on this. Think about what a $1,000 limit looks like on an average NFL Sunday when sides are updated on a Sunday morning. Most books, by the time they have the liquidity in for sides on a Sunday morning, are opening up to 50 and 100K.
Yeah, Dustin, you're 100% correct. Like they're not going to lose. They're not going to lose their shirts on this at all by opening. It is one of those things where I can't wrap my brain around it. I think it's a lot to keep up with, and maybe some of these books just decide it's not worth the trouble or whatever to keep up with stuff. But I mean, you looked at DraftKings even Thursday night before the draft. Trayvon Walker got steamed all the way up to minus 800, and if you're listening to this, I assume you know what that means, but that means you have to bet $800 to win 100. Like, you're not losing your shirt over that, because there is a very minute amount of bettors out there who are ever going to bet $800 to win $100. It doesn't matter how sure thing anything is, right? I mean, most people are just risk averse when it comes to stuff like that. And so you're right. I mean, that's the juice changes, the limits change, all the different stuff like that. So if you choose not to offer this stuff, it is strictly because you just don't want to deal with it.
Yeah. And again, broken record, you can do this offshore. You have been able to do this offshore for forever. That's not always a reason to have a market or allow a certain type of betting, but this certainly is, because they're going to take that action if you don't, so you might as well.